Now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker of the morning, Jeffrey Selingo. Jeff serves as the editor-at-large for the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the top news source for over 70,000 academics, including me. I start every day with the Chronicle at my bedside on my iPad, and how many of us throughout the day say something like, "Did you see what was in the Chronicle this morning?" And that's all we have to say, and there's immediate recognition. So this publication is part of our fabric, part of our DNA in many regards. So Jeff has a long career and a highly acclaimed columnist and editor, including awards from the Education Writers Association, the Society of Professional Journalists, and the Associated Press. And he was a finalist for the prestigious Livingston Award for Young Journalist. Jeff has appeared on NPR, PBS, ABC, and MSNBC, and his writing has been published in the New York Times and the Washington Post, among others. Throughout his career, Jeff has focused his attention on the dynamic changes in higher education. His written analysis has culminated in his very recently published book, which you all have in your hands or on the table in front of you, College UnBound. And I'd like to add congratulations on the successful publication of this book, Jeff. Congratulations. Not done yet. What I've always found compelling about Jeff's writing in his articles, blogs, and Twitter posts is that he is provocative, and yet he is also starkly realistic. His writing is student-centered and challenges us to ensure that we are doing our best for our students during these changing and challenging times. He questions everything from alternative means to affordable tuition, effective workforce development, to the real story behind retention and graduation rates. Jeff also looks to the benefits of technology for educational improvement in addition to innovation. Jeff's message could not be more timely as the Vermont State Colleges engage in a system-wide strategic inquiry to ensure that we are positioned well to serve our current and our future students. I am inspired by Jeff's ideas and think that we are very lucky to have him here with us today to share his words off the paper and into our conference space. Please welcome Jeffrey Selingo.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here in Vermont. Thanks a lot for the invite. I always try to figure out if I have anything, any connection to the audience, and we do have some connection in that I got my undergraduate degree from Ithaca College in New York. And in my office a couple weeks ago was Peggy Williams, who had a long and distinguished career, I know, in the state college system here, before she became president at Ithaca, which was after my time at Ithaca. But I got to know Peggy through a lot of alumni events at Ithaca, and she sends her well wishes when she knew I was coming up here. As Phil gave my my bio, the introduction, you'll notice that I've never worked on a college campus. And so I always try to make that point before I start speaking, so you know that where I'm coming from. So where I'm coming from is 16 years of covering higher education as an observer. And so some of the comments today, you might say, well, that's not realistic because you've never worked on a college campus. But I always think, well, you know, I'm a journalist, and I've supervised journalists, and in some ways I think journalists and faculty members are cut from the same cloth, and which is why I think there's actually some movement sometimes between journalism and academe. You know, we have a deep skepticism for anything new. We question things a lot. We like to write about change, but we do not like to be changed. And I think faculty members like to teach about change, but they don't like to be changed. So I think that there is a lot of similarities between journalists and faculty members. There also, I think, is a lot of similarities between what has happened to the journalism industry over the last decade plus and what is right now happening, I think, to higher education. It's interesting to me. I've been to a lot of these similar gatherings over the last year and a half as I've been researching my book. And as I sit in them and as I listen to the conversations and as I hear the speakers, I'm amazed at the similarities between what I'm hearing now in higher education and what I heard 15 years ago, or about 12 years ago, I guess now, 12, 15 years ago, when I was a reporter and an editor at the Chronicle. And I would go to journalism conferences and publishing industry gatherings somewhat like this, and all the talk was about the internet and what it would do to newspapers. And this was the late 90s, and everybody thought the internet in newspapers at that time was a fad, and it would go away. And somebody would get up and talk to us, and they said, one day, people will read news on things like this. Of course, they didn't have this to show, but they said it will be something that you can hold in your pocket, and you'll read the news, and everybody in the audience said, oh, that's never going to happen. Or it will be on an electronic tablet, and that will never happen. I mean, remember, this was an era when few people even used laptops. And there was a couple of themes that I remember just kept emerging, and one of them was a little bit of hubris. I think that most of this was a very successful decade for the newspaper industry. And I think many people in the room just said, you know what, we're a public trust. Everybody gets up in the morning, they walk down their driveway, they get a newspaper, we're always going to be around. I think there was this skepticism of anything new, and there just was a belief that why would anybody want to read a newspaper on something like this? Why wouldn't they want to read it on paper? And again, this is what I'm now seeing in higher ed in many ways. And I just throw this out as a warning that many other industries, whether it was music, whether it was newspapers, whether it was book publishing or other industries, all have had a period of great success where they kind of didn't pay attention to what was happening around them, or they dismissed it. And then right after that, they were kind of enveloped by this massive change overnight, and were kind of and seemed to be unprepared for it. And I just throw that out as a warning to you at the start here for higher education. So here's what I hope to do today. I want to walk through some of the themes in my book, under the assumption that you didn't have a chance to look at it yet, and kind of talk at the 50,000-foot level about some of the change coming to higher ed. You might think 20 minutes through that this is all doom and gloom, and why are you here? But trust me, I think there are a lot of great opportunities for higher education, and I'm actually very confident about its future. And then I hope to leave some time, and definitely leave some time for questions and answers, and have a discussion that brings the conversation much more down to the level of your specific jobs or your specific institutions. So I want to tell you a little bit about how I got interested in this subject. I was the editor of the Chronicle for 4 years, and near the end of that term, as editor, I had the chance to get invited to Harvard Business School, where Clay Christensen was putting on a day-long summit on the future of higher ed. And this was the summer of 2011. And he was about to come out with his book on disruption. He's the father of the disruptive innovation movement in the U.S. And his discussion that day was about how higher education was going to go through these massive changes. And there were about 50 of us in the room, some from within higher ed, some within the business community, philanthropies, consultants, and so forth. And to be honest with you, half of what I heard that day fascinated me, and the other half, to be honest with you, scared me. And I went back from that conference, and I said to my boss, I'm not quite sure what to make of this. This is not what I heard that day, is not what I'm editing in the Chronicle day in and day out. And if this is truly the future, I think that we need to get a better handle on this. And so I wrote this very long memo and ended up moving into a different job because of it. And the last, which is a great thing, and the last year and a half I've spent mostly on the road, visiting colleges, visiting high schools, middle schools, talking to employers, professors, presidents, you name it, about what I see as the future of higher ed. I've also gone to a ton, let me tell you, there is like a conference a week in higher ed now on the future. So if you want a good business, definitely get into the business of the future of higher ed, because as I sit in these conferences, I realize that there's a lot of talk about what might happen, and I'll tell you some of that today. And none of us, of course, know really what's going to happen in the next 15 or 20 years. And I'm often reminded of this cartoon. How many of you remember the Jetsons? This was a cartoon, of course, from the 1960s, imagining life in 2020 or 2010, 2015, right around the time we're living now. And of course, this is not what life is like now. And so there is a lot of hype about the future of higher ed. And so I hope today to kind of tell you what I think is reality and some of what I think is hype. And when I get invited places, people say, oh, you're going to say technology is the answer to everything. And so I want to tell you a little bit about what you will not hear from me today. The first is that the residential colleges no longer have a place in American higher education. I actually believe they do. I do not believe these theories that 50% of colleges and universities are going to go out of business in the next 10 or 15 years. In the reporting for my book, I realized that colleges are much like cities. They evolve over time. They don't just disappear. Like businesses. That online education is the answer. I think it's part of the answer, but it's not the answer. I don't think that suddenly, again, colleges and universities are going to be replaced by online institutions in the next 5, 10, or 15 years. The fact of the matter is 18-year-olds, for the most part, just don't want to study purely online. And then the final thing is that the liberal arts are dead. There's a lot of discussion now about practical training versus a broad education. I think that we need both, and that I don't believe that suddenly institutions are going to just become job training centers for a future economy. To be honest with you, that we have no idea what that future economy is going to be in 5 or 10 years. So I kind of want to set the stage by saying I'm not here to be a critic of higher ed and say these are all the things that are going to happen, because I truly don't believe that. But change is coming, and why now? Obviously, if you look back through the history of higher education, even the past 10 or 20 years, it seems every couple of years there are predictions of changes in higher ed, and the question is why now? And so I think we trace this back to the economic downturn of 2008. And three things kind of came together in the last couple of years. The first is that the housing market collapsed across the country. In some places more than others, obviously, but across the board that there was this collapse in the housing market. And the last decade growth at American colleges and universities and tuition growth especially, and paying for that tuition growth, was really fueled by home equity and the money that parents had in their homes. It's not that necessarily that incomes increased drastically during that decade, but families felt wealthier because they had this money. And of course, with the housing crash, parents could no longer use their home as an ATM, and they obviously then had less money to pay for college. Second, and I know in this state you've never had great state support for higher education, but across the country, state support for higher education took a nosedive after 2008, primarily because the states were squeezed because of the economy. And then finally, you had the federal deficits that started growing after 2008. And you combine all three of those pieces together, and the fact of the matter is that students and parents now are paying more out of pocket for higher education. And when they do, they start making different decisions about where they want to go to college. My theory is that 10 years ago, students and parents were willing to go to almost any college at any price because they thought higher education was worth it. Now, with all of these pressures, whether it's from on the state financial aid programs, whether it's from the federal government, or whether it's on home equity, it's forcing parents now to make and students to make decisions based more on actual pocketbook issues. And when they do that, value becomes much more of a consideration for them when they're talking about college, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So some of this is about rising costs, but a lot of this, to be honest with you, is about stagnant income. And as I talk to college officials across the country, they keep telling me, you know what, we have worked really hard in the last couple of years to hold down our costs. What's happening? Why are people still complaining about rising tuition costs? Well, some of it, to be honest with you, is out of your hands. So this shows you briefly over the last 10 years the average tuition as a percentage of median earnings in the U.S. And you'll see that in 2001, average tuition took up less than 25% of average earnings. It's now closer to 40%. So in that time, it's risen from kind of a less than a quarter of a person's paycheck to now almost 40%. And now tuition obviously has slowed down, still going up over the last 10 years. The problem has actually been that income is going down. And so what we're seeing is that tuition, even though it's flattened out a little bit, is now taking up a larger chunk of money of families. And again, this is why you're continuing to see worry among parents and students. You know, I have 2 young kids at home. One who's 3.5 and one who's 1.5. So I've been thinking a lot about this lately. And so I figured out recently what it would cost the 3.5-year-old to go to college. The top number there, nearly $74,000 to go to a public 4-year, just tuition alone, when she's 18. And if she wanted to go to a private 4-year, $213,000. Again, tuition alone. I don't know where she's going to live or how she's going to eat, but this is tuition alone at the current rate we're going. Obviously, somewhat unsustainable, or definitely unsustainable in many ways. And this is why I think there's a lot of concern among parents and students about the value of college. And then, at the same time, we have the disappearing state. And again, something that you've dealt with for a long time here in Vermont, but every state now is seeing huge declines in public higher education financing. In fact, 39 states gave less to higher education last year than they did 4 years ago. And at the current trends, if you take the average state budget, it will reach 0 in 2059. In the U.S. at the current funding levels. There's many ways to measure this, but almost any way you measure it, it's essentially states are getting out of the business of public higher education. And by one measure, states now give less per capita per student than they did in 1965, when there were about 15 million fewer students in the system. So again, by any measure, states are getting out of the business of public higher education. So what's happening? So states now are looking for new revenue sources. And when they look for new revenue sources, they're looking for new students. They're looking across the globe, and they're also looking in other states. But part of the problem is that there are fewer paying students that they can find. This is analysis that was done for a small private college, actually in the Mid-Atlantic, but I think it has a lot of application to colleges of all sizes. And what the trustees of this small private college wanted to know is, okay, of all the 18, what is our true market if we need more students who could pay more of the bill? What's our true market? And so they looked at all 18-year-olds across the country in 2009, and then of course they took out the students who didn't graduate from high school, so that's a quarter of those students right off the bat. They looked at those students who expressed interest in going to a 4-year college, who had the SAT and the GPA to qualify to be high academic qualifications for that college. They looked at family income, very high family income. This is a private college, so they needed family income over $200,000 a year. Then, of course, they needed students who actually wanted to go to a private college, who wanted to go to a private college in the Northeast. And suddenly, all these students kept dropping out of the system until at the end of the day, they realized there were fewer than 1,000 students who fit the qualifications they were looking for. Fewer than 1,000 out of 4.3 million. And of course, they weren't the only ones after these students. They came to realize that it's dozens and dozens and dozens of other colleges. And so they were now competing in a world not only with other privates, but increasingly with publics going after students in other states who could pay out-of-state tuition. Not only are they competing with what we think of as traditional higher ed, but one of the things I came to realize in the reporting for my book is that we no longer have a common definition of what we mean by higher education in this country. So if you think after World War II with the GI Bill in the 50s and 60s with the race to space and then the Cold War, we kind of all had a common definition of what we meant by education after high school. And now we have so many more players in the system. And I'll briefly talk about some of these today, but there's things like the Khan Academy, which reaches 4 million people a month, many in middle school and high school. It was really interesting to me as I was talking to middle school and high school students, and I asked them, about some of their classes, and they said, "Do you know about the Khan Academy?" So many of them told me about lessons in school that they weren't quite getting, that they would go home, they would fire up the Khan Academy, and they would kind of get the lessons that they weren't getting in school through places like the Khan Academy. And then there's the Open Learning Initiative out of Carnegie Mellon University, which has redesigned more than 24 introductory courses, spending about several $1 million on them, and taking 9 months to design them. Again, I'll talk a little bit about that later today. And Western Governors University, which has a competency-based degree program, meaning it's based on what you learn and what you know, not based on how much time you spend in a seat. The average person at Western Governors finishes their degree in 2.5 years and pays $18,000. They're growing at 40% a year, and they're now the largest provider of urban school teachers in the country. And then, of course, the ones that everyone seems to be talking about are the MOOCs providers, the edXs, and the Coursera's of the world. My argument actually is that they are not necessarily the big disruptor in higher education that we should be paying attention to, even though the New York Times likes to write about them every day. I actually think the competency-based education model that Western Governors and now several other state universities, including Wisconsin and Arizona, are experimenting with potentially could be a much bigger disruptor in the future of higher ed. So this, to me, what I call the value gap or the value equation in American higher ed is perhaps the biggest disruptive force in the future of higher ed. And this is why do I say that? So every year, various people ask this question of Americans about what they think about the value of higher ed. And as you can see, it's increasingly going down since 2008, since the economic downturn. It's not that Americans don't think college is worth it. Because if you look at every survey, they know the results of things like, you're more likely to be employed if you have a college degree. They know the payoff of a college degree means that you're probably going to make almost more than $1 million over the course of your lifetime than with somebody without a college degree. But what they're increasingly asking parents and students, is it worth getting a degree from this specific college? So it's not the value of higher education overall. It's the value of individual colleges and the value of individual degrees. So for so long, higher education kind of has sold this economic argument. A lot of people now in higher ed don't like the fact that there's kind of this focus on return on investment, but to be honest with you, for 2 or 3 decades, higher education as a whole has talked about the economic benefits of higher education. Every couple of years, the College Board puts out a study called Education Pays. And so no longer, though, my contention is that colleges and universities could ride the coattails of those national averages, and that now the tools exist, which I'll talk about in a little bit, the tools exist to look at the return on investment of individual colleges and of individual degrees. Here's where I think the problem is on this. So a couple of years ago, the Pew Research Center, and then last year, the Carnegie Corporation asked the public what they think about the value of higher education, and then they asked college presidents. 57% of the public thought their college degree was fair or good for the money spent. So the question was, what do you think about the value for the money spent? 57% said fair or good. Among college presidents, 76% said excellent or good. And this is what I call the value gap, because it's a gap between the public perception and the people running the institutions, which is growing. And my contention is until this shrinks or gets a little bit closer until presidents start to realize that they do have to prove their value more often than they are now, that I think that this divide between the public and higher education is only going to grow. So why don't we have more innovation around these areas then? And my contention, as I've been going around the country visiting colleges and universities, I've been really surprised by the fact of what drives so many colleges and universities continues to be this prestige race in American higher education. And so I recently came across this quote about higher education, which is, prestige is to higher education as profit is to corporations. So how do we measure quality in higher education right now? How do we measure the value added to somebody coming out with a college degree? It's still primarily measured on prestige, the prestige of the institution, which is mostly based on inputs, the students coming into the system, not necessarily the students coming out of the system. And I'm talking mostly about rankings. And so many of the college presidents that I met didn't want to experiment, and board members as well, didn't want to experiment with new things because they were worried that they wouldn't look like the institution down the street, across the town, or the institutions that they compete with. And so that they wanted to, they said, oh yeah, innovation is great, but we need to innovate around the edges a little bit. We don't, because if we look too different from the institutions we're competing with, we're not going to be able to go up in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. It was really interesting to me as I visited many college campuses that we continue to have a very romantic vision of American higher education. So, you know, the campus quads, the neo-Gothic buildings, the fall football weekends. But reality is that that is really a Hollywood vision of American higher education. So 4 in 5 students tell researchers they're drifting through college. They don't quite know why they're there. They went there because somebody told them to go. They don't quite know what they want to do. A third of students now transfer institutions at least once before they get their degree. This is new, fairly new research from the National Student Clearinghouse. A third of students now transfer at least once. So they don't come to one institution, stay there, and graduate. And then 400,000 students drop out. So we think American higher education is serving students well. We have this romantic vision of what we think it is, but in many ways, this is the reality. And why is that? So, you know, for the most part, students, back in the 50s and 60s, worked alone. Then they were in large lecture halls being taught by professors. But the reality is that if you look today on college campuses, is that you still have the lecture halls on college campuses, albeit in color now, rather than black and white from the 1950s. But students are no longer working alone. They're working collaboratively, they're toggling between devices, and they want an education in a different way. They want it delivered to them in a way where they learn best. In some cases, that might be face-to-face small group learning. In some cases, that might be the lecture hall. Rarely. In other cases, it might be a combination, a hybrid course where they're doing some of the work online and some of it face-to-face, and in other cases, it might be in fully online. And so we're not really delivering, for the most part, American higher education. The reason why it's having so much trouble keeping students and students are transferring is that it's not living up to the promise. It's not living up to what students demand today. One of the most rewarding things for me in reporting this book was meeting students. So as you read the book, hopefully you will see stories of students, not necessarily of the future, but of today, who are living higher education in a much different way than students did 10 or 20 years ago. And we continue to have a system that is, for the most part, one size fits all, when the students today are already getting their education in many different ways and want more of a kind of a la carte system where they can pick different pieces off. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the students that I met during my reporting for the book and talk a little bit about how they're getting their education. So the first is is Jose, who I met at Ventura College down in Florida, who is one of many of these students, the third of students who are transferring institutions, who's swirling around. So he's one of these students who doesn't go to just one college or university. He's moving through the system in a way right now assisted by the state of Florida, but for many of these students, they're having trouble kind of swirling through the system without much guidance. There was Sam Romano, who was thinking about going back to get his master's degree, and then came across a massively online open course being taught by Sebastian Thrun at Stanford University in artificial intelligence. He knew that was the exact skill he needed, but more important, he knew that Sebastian Thrun worked for Google and he wanted to work for Google. He took the class, worked with some coworkers of his on the class, and 6 months after the class, where he scored near perfect scores on the exams, he ended up getting a job with Google, totally bypassing the current system by not getting the master's degree that he thought about going. And then we have Jennifer Black, who was a student at the University of Central Florida, where 60% of students in any one semester are taking online, hybrid, or face-to-face courses. She was able to take many extra credits and still graduate in 4 years, still work, still do internships by the flexibility offered by a system that allowed face-to-face, hybrid, and online courses. We have Cyril Shu, who took a competency-based degree program, a returning adult. We have Sam Schmeider, who took a gap year. And so he was one of many students I met during the reporting for this book who discovered they weren't quite sure what they wanted to do when they went to college, and so it was best to take a year off. And my contention in the book is that we don't offer enough experiences for students at 18 who are not necessarily ready for college. And really, when you look at them, when you look at the options, they can go to the military, they could go get a job, or they could go to college or do nothing, but we really don't have many other options for them. Sam was able to take off a year, did AmeriCorps for a year, worked with his hands, worked with people that he probably really never interacted with before in his life, and kind of came to realize what he really wanted, and ended up going to college a year later. And then we have Pedro Maldonado, who I met actually somewhat down the road in Manchester at Southern New Hampshire University, who's part of their college UnBound program, same title as the book, but slightly different, which blends the experience between work, high school, and college. So the point of this is that there is no one student anymore, and there's no one learning experience. And that colleges that try to present a one-size-fits-all to all the students, in my mind, are not going to succeed in the future. And that the ones that are going to succeed are the ones that create multiple models to allow students to kind of swirl through the system and get what they need to get. So let's talk a little bit about how this might work. There's a lot of talk right now about flipped classrooms and hybrid courses, and I want to give two examples of how this has worked recently at two different places. So let's take edX. So San Jose State University has a circuits course that they teach to students in engineering, and they had a big problem with it. What was happening was that 40% of students in any given semester were failing and had to repeat the course year after year after year. And so the department got together and they looked at what edX was offering in terms of its circuits course, and they said, hey, this is pretty good. Why don't we try it out? Why don't we take the edX content and instead of our professors teaching that content, our professors act more as the guide on the side, more as the coach in the classroom. And they tried this out for one semester, and the repeat rate went from 40% to 20%, using the content from edX. They are now repeating that concept, and they're using it in other courses. There's been some pushback, as many of you might have read, at San Jose when the president suggested they do this for many more courses, including philosophy and a couple of other things, and some of the faculty members said no way, and they pushed back on that. But it is working in some departments. Obviously, more research needs to be done on that. And then there's the idea of hybrid courses, which there was a big study last year that Ithaca S&R did, where they took Open Learning Initiative content. So Open Learning Initiative, for those of you not familiar with it, out of Carnegie Mellon University, they have some big grants from some big philanthropies, and they focus on redesigning courses. I call them in the book the Cadillac of online courses, because in my mind, they spend more time than anyone else in designing a course to go online. And so I actually was able to sit in on one of their redesigned courses where they have a faculty member, a graduate student, they have a couple of learning scientists who take the place of the student as they're designing the course. So they will go over one concept over and over again until they get it just perfect to present it to the student. And then they have a team of data scientists that are looking at every keystroke that a student is making. Why is a student answering that question wrong, but this question right? And they're constantly redesigning the courses based on that. That's why it takes 8 or 9 months for them to design a course, and it costs $500,000. Obviously, most people don't have that time or those resources, but Carnegie Mellon gives those courses away, or the Open Learning Initiative gives those courses away for free. And so last year, Ithaca S&R decided to do a study, and Bill Bowen, former president of Princeton, was the lead author on the study, where they gave this hybrid course away to 6 public universities. It was in statistics. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to find out, how does a student in the hybrid course perform against a student in the face-to-face course? And they studied the students at the beginning of the semester, at the mid part of the semester, at the end of the semester. They did surveys of the students. And what they found was that the students in the face-to-face course and in the hybrid course essentially had the same learning outcomes. They had the same satisfaction scores, although students seem to prefer the face-to-face course a little bit more. But for the most part, they had the same learning outcomes and the same preferences. But they ended up, the key finding of this report was that the students in the hybrid course finished it in 25% less time than the students in the face-to-face course. And to me, this is really the power of hybrid courses and personalized learning, the competency-based model that some people are using, in that it allows us to potentially break apart the academic calendar in a way. So there's really nothing secret, or there's nothing special, I should say, about the 15-week semester or the 16-week semester. Somebody years ago decided that it should be that, right? And there's nothing that special also about 120 credits for a bachelor's degree. Again, at some point we decided that's what a bachelor's degree is worth. We decided on 15-week semesters. We decided we should begin school in September and end it in May. But the whole academic calendar, as we think about it, is set up for this one-size-fits-all system when students learn at different stages and at different paces. So some students might take 17 weeks to master a concept, and some students might take 2 weeks. So if we are able to personalize the learning, whether it's through competencies or whether it's through hybrid courses or other means, just imagine what that can do for the academic calendar. And this is where I see an UnBound future. So we could create mini semesters. It still kind of keeps the semester idea, but Arizona State is, for example, experimenting with 7.5-week semesters now. So they were seeing students finishing, some of their students were taking online courses, which were 7.5 weeks, and then they had nothing to do for 7.5 weeks because they couldn't enroll in a 15-week semester or 15-week course after 7.5 weeks. So they created 7.5-week semesters. These 7.5-week semesters have also been useful to students who are coming out of remedial education. So they have also, Arizona State, as I talk about in the book, has redesigned how they do remedial education. They used to have students packed in a room like this, a professor at the front of the room. The students would never get out of remedial math, for example. Some students were able to move more quickly, some students weren't able to move as quickly. And so they have now adopted an adaptive learning platform which allows students to move at their own pace through remedial math. So I visited this remedial math course in October of last fall, and half the class was already done with the course because they were able to move through the concepts at their own speed. And previously, they had to wait around for 7.5 weeks. They were now able to enroll in a course and actually start earning credits. The other advantage of mixing together different models like this is that, for example, students can take a couple of 15-week courses and some 7.5-week courses. So if the 15-week course is very difficult, it usually becomes most difficult at the end of the semester. And by that time, if they've taken some 7.5-week courses, they're done with those courses at the point that the 15-week courses are becoming very difficult, which allows them to focus more on them. Again, mixing and matching. All of this, of course, provides a lot of flexibility for students to finish early, for them to increase their retention, and finally to do some other types of learning, whether that's study abroad, community service, or service learning, offers more flexibility. The one thing that I kept hearing over and over from students about what they wanted out of the future of higher education was flexibility, and that the academic calendar and the way the academic calendar is designed at most colleges and universities is that it didn't offer that flexibility. It's not just an unbound future, in my opinion, for students, but also for faculty. And I want to let's think about the online component of universities for a moment. So when online education kind of became very popular in the last decade and a half, it was really focused at the institutional level. Institutions were starting to have online arms. And then we moved into what I call federations. So what interests me about edX and Coursera is that these are institutions that compete on every other front for students, for faculty, for money, but they're now cooperating on this academic platform. So we're moving from an institution-specific model to more of a federation. And then finally, I think there's even going to be a further evolution in this, and I think places like Coursera and edX will move that forward by having more free agents. So think about some of the more popular professors on edX or Coursera. In some ways, they are less identified with their institution than they are identified as superstars themselves. And the idea that these people necessarily have to come from the best institutions in the country, I don't think is necessarily true. It's already happening. This is MR University, Marginal Revolution University. It's run by Tyler Cowen, who is an economist at George Mason University, who has a very popular blog called Marginal Revolution, read by 200,000 people a day. And he decided, why not put my course content up online? Still teaches at George Mason. They weren't doing a MOOC, so he's like, I'm going to create my own MOOC. And he decided to put his course content up online. Of course, he's not giving course credit or nobody's paying for it, but this to me offers the idea that professors can be unbound from their institutions and offer their courses on their own. Now, of course, we still have to figure out the accreditation and the money part of it, but we're starting to see experiments in this way. So I mentioned earlier that about the disruptions in the other industries, whether it was newspapers or whether it was music or whether it was publishing. And this quote I found from the publishing executive at Amazon. And as I read it, I started to think about the application to higher education. And if the really only necessary people in the publishing process are the writer and the reader, are the really only necessary people in higher education the professor, the teacher, and the student? And everyone who stands between those two, i.e. the institution, has both risk and opportunity. And what does that mean for then the campus experience as we think about it today? If we can move to the next slide, thank you. What does that mean for the campus experience as we look toward the future of higher education? I actually think all of these changes happening now in higher ed offer plenty of opportunities for colleges, for residential colleges, to kind of re-exert their value by focusing on what is really important at the campus level. And so in my book, I talk a lot to employers and to students and to professors and others about the skills, the necessary skills for the future workforce. And many people gave me many different things, but I kind of grouped them together in different buckets. And I kept hearing over and over again about what students wanted out of the academic experience. And so this is what I kept hearing over and over again. And so the advice I give to students is to seek passionate faculty, to dive deep into a research project, to go on a global experience, to be creative, take risks, and learn how to fail. To me, what you exactly major in college is less important in many cases than the experiences you get out of college. Mainly because the economy is changing at such a fast pace that to try to figure out what you should major in today for a job that might not even exist in 4 years, or to try to figure out what to major in for jobs that we don't even know, we can't even imagine will exist in 4 years. And so I think it's much more important to focus on these experiences. And if you look at these experiences, the other thing you will notice is that they're very difficult to replicate online. And so to me, this allows traditional colleges and universities, residential campuses and universities, to kind of re-exert their value by focusing on those pieces of the residential experience that can't be replicated online. Undergraduate research, global experiences, creativity, figuring out ways to teach students how to fail and learn from those failures, and re-exerting kind of the faculty-student mentorship and relationship. All things that can't be replicated online. The other thing that I think potentially could allow colleges and universities, and I was talking to some of your folks before this presentation, where I see some of the more interesting things happening right now in higher ed, and where I see the entrepreneurs who are trying to kind of put higher education, or they think put higher education institutions out of business, happens around the transition points of college, meaning between high school and college and the transition to the workforce. These are areas where students are really struggling. So when students drop out, they tend to drop out after their freshman year, or they tend to transfer during their freshman year. And many students, especially around this time of year, are kind of struggling to launch their careers. And where I'm seeing a lot of entrepreneurs kind of enter into this area is around both of these transition points, high school to college and college to the workforce. So we have things like Institute, which is this place, which is a startup out of New York City, which is offering apprenticeships to students and then building a curriculum around that. So it's aimed at students who are not college ready, or not quite sure why they want to go to college, or might have had some college experience, but we really want to make a much better connection between the workforce and college. And then there's the transition to the workforce. So things like Teach for America, which obviously has been around for a while, or Venture for America, which takes the Teach for America model and puts students in startup companies for 2 years after college, and kind of gives them a sense of what it is to work in a startup, gives them a sense of working in a much larger company. Because again, the transitions from college to work and high school to college are two of the most difficult points around the college experience right now, and where I think there's a lot of opportunity for colleges to re-exert their brands. And so I want to end today talking a little bit about defining value. So I talked earlier about the value gap in American higher education, and how I think in the future that colleges have to do much more in defining value around their own institutions and around their own programs. Because if you don't do it, others will define it for you. Next slide. So this is a quote from President Obama at the State of the Union this year, where he talks about how the administration is going to put out a tool the next day where, based on one simple criteria, where you can get the most bang for your educational buck. And so this idea of return on investment. And so the next day, the administration put out the college report card, the scorecard, which now rates colleges on a number of different measures, including graduation rates, costs, loan default rates, and a number of other measures. And so really looking at the various factors that students should be looking at when they're looking at colleges. The Chronicle a couple weeks ago put out something called College Reality Check, which essentially does the same thing as the college scorecard, and again, looks at institutions across the board, what students will, how much debt students will take on, what they're projected to make their first couple of years out of college, what are the loan default rates, what are the graduation rates, what is the net price of the student, again, allowing students to compare institutions across the board. This is something that St. Olaf College and a number of other colleges now are doing. St. Olaf College out of Minnesota. And what they've decided is instead of just taking a survey of their graduates and saying 91% are employed 6 months after graduation, they've decided to take a much deeper dive. And so this is a database that they have on their website. This example is from the class of 2011, which allows you to look up any major and see what students are doing with that major, where they are, in the actual name of the corporation, what job they have, and in some cases, what their salary is. Obviously, their name's not attached to it. But it gives students and parents a perspective. To me, this is more of an admissions tool because it gives students and parents a perspective of, okay, what can I do with an English degree or an economics degree? And it gives them a sense of the different types of jobs that graduates are holding. And just imagine 5, 10, 15 years from now what a database like this will look like. Not easy to put together, not just based on surveys, because no one answers surveys anymore, but also done by scouring social media and other resources. So I want to end on this quote again because I talked about how this is not all doom and gloom because I think there's a lot of opportunities for colleges. So we have both risks and opportunities, and I want to talk briefly about all of those. So here are what I see as the biggest risks to colleges and universities writ large. Some of these very specific to you, others not as pertinent to you, but I want to talk about them, and then during Q&A, we could talk more specifically about them. So here are the biggest risks, I think. The commodity courses. These are the courses that every college teaches, in many cases offering them the introductory courses to freshmen, at many big state universities, stuffing hundreds of colleges in a classroom using the same book, using essentially the same syllabus. And these are the courses the MOOC providers and others are going after to provide. What does that do? And this is probably less of an issue for you, but what does that do for graduate programs at many colleges and universities? Some graduate programs exist primarily, or at least the size of them, exists to provide labor to those commodity courses. And so what does that mean for graduate studies at some bigger universities? A risk and an opportunity are free agent professors. If professors could become their own brands, and again, I don't think it just has to be at the nation's elite colleges and universities. What does that mean for the connection between the institution and the professor? And then finally is the credentialing function of colleges and universities. I don't think that we're going to suddenly see the bachelor's degree disappear, but where I see the credentialing function being under a lot of pressure right now is at the graduate and the kind of the certificate level, and where MOOCs primarily and other providers could potentially make inroads is in this area where students have alternatives to an expensive certificate or graduate program. Very much like the student I mentioned, Sam Romano, thinking about going back to get a graduate degree and decides to take this free MOOC, totally bypassing that credentialing system and still gets the job that he wants. So what are some of the opportunities for colleges and universities? Certifying experiences. So if students are going to move around the system a lot more and move between providers and have jobs and do study abroad, at the end of the day, somebody has to certify that experience as being worth it. We know that a bachelor's degree is more than just a collection of 120 credits. There's actually a curriculum behind it, and somebody's going to need to certify it. College networks. So this is the idea that, again, one of the interesting things that I found about edX and Coursera is that colleges that normally compete on every other front are now cooperating on the academic side. And what networks can you build, not only within your state, but outside the state, with other colleges very similar to you, to offer academic programs that you're not able to offer now? redesigning the first year, I think, offers potentially the biggest chance to prove value, capture students you're not capturing now, and that to me proves your value, which I think is probably, again, increasingly parents and students are looking less just at price, and they're looking at value between institutions. So, what will happen? As I'll go back to the beginning with the Jetsons cartoon. I could be laying out a vision that we could come back here in 5 years that could be not true and could be further from the truth than it is today. But one of the things I realized in researching this book is that there are two truths about change, and one of them is we tend to overestimate how fast something's going to happen. So we always think something's going to happen tomorrow when it takes 10 years or 15 years. But we tend to underestimate the depth of change. So usually what ends up happening is that the change comes fast, it comes slower than we think it's going to, but it actually is more disruptive than we ever think it will be. And with that, I have some time for questions and answers, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Mentioned that parents used to remortgage their homes to pay for college. It concerns me that, well, let me just back up. My husband's actually a bankruptcy attorney. And one of the things that anecdotally he has mentioned to me for the past 5 years is that more and more people are coming to see him with enormous loans, student loan debt. And in fact, the banks have been pushing more and more student loans onto parents and students because they're the one thing, if you file for bankruptcy, other than child support, you can't get discharged. And it seems to me that that's a flaw in our system where banks can push, like literally $200,000 worth of student loan debt, and it seems like I don't even know what question I'm exactly asking, other than, is there any kind of talk about this in higher ed circles and maybe a lobby against the banks not being allowed to do this?
Right, and so the bigger issue to me on the parent side are the Parent Plus loans, which have we've seen a huge increase in the volume of Parent Plus loans. So what's happened since 2008 particularly is that as parents have had less access to cash from their homes, for example, they've turned to Parent Plus loans. And more colleges are increasingly packaging Parent Plus loans as part of the financial aid package and increasing larger and larger amounts of them. So I have a story in the book about students that I met in Florida where some of the Parent Plus loans for the first year, for just the freshman year, were $18,000 to $24,000 1 year. Multiply that by 4, the parent's suddenly $100,000 in debt for one child. And that's just the parent. Doesn't include the student loan for the student. And of course the parent is on the hook for the Parent Plus loan, and not the student. And this is where I think there's a lot of pressure on this, and this is why I think it comes back to the value argument. And so as students and families look at all the data that's available to them as they pick a college, my argument is that they should look at graduation rates. They should look at net price. They should look at how much debt they are going to be in when they graduate, cumulative debt, not just that first year debt. What is the loan default rate of that college? So these are, I think, the measures now that students and parents should look at and say, you know what, in some cases it might be worth, I don't think it's ever worth, by the way, going $100,000 just for the parent to go into debt for college in addition to whatever the student is going into. But a school might look cheaper on the face value for a student, but they might have a fairly low graduation rate. So the chances of you actually getting out of there or getting out of there in 4 years is probably not very good, and thus you're going to end up paying more money anyway. And these are right now, parents always had this information available to them and they never really used it. They're still not really using it, but as more and more tools like what I showed you, like the President's Scorecard and other things come out, I think they're going to start asking these questions more often. And right now, I think most colleges and universities are not prepared to answer them. And that's why it comes back to this idea of value and how do you show the value of your programs. And some of that is economic, and I know that this bothers a lot of people in higher ed just to talk about the economic value of your programs, but then we have to figure out a way to measure the other value-added things you're doing. You know, what does college do for a 18-year-old by the time they're 22, by the time they're 30, by the time they're 40? And until we figure out a story around that, I think that this issue is going to be increasingly a crush on families, and as a result, I think they're going to stop going to certain colleges.
If students are so different and their trajectories so varied, with which I agree, then why is it that the indicators of student success are so traditional and so deeply rooted, like graduation rates yep. in freshmen and the traditional federal cohort?
Right.
And if that's true, is there anything we can do about that?
I think there's now there's movement on this. I think that we're starting to get better data. I think the data, for example, that the National Student Clearinghouse is putting out is much. They capture transfers, they capture part-time students, they capture a lot more students, and they have 96% coverage across the country. And that data like that, which they never really released publicly until recently, is now pushing the federal government, especially on graduation rates. And so we are told over and over again that the administration is going to rethink how they measure graduation rates. Of course, this would have all been figured out a couple of years ago if we had just moved to a student unit record system, which mostly the private colleges were against. But we are moving in that direction. You're right. For the most part, the data are terrible in terms of parents trying to figure this out, and especially on graduation rates, a very flawed measure. But it's the best we have right now. Yeah. Yeah, we have about 5 more minutes, I think, right? Yeah.
What do you think the implications are? What do you think the implications are for adjuncts, who, as we know, are massively underpaid across the board, across the country?
Well, this is the part that I don't quite get. As colleges and universities have tried to save money, they moved obviously more in the adjunct market, and they've reduced the roles of full-time professors. Let's forget about tenure for a second, but just full-time professors. And what was interesting, if you go back to that slide of opportunities and and earlier of kind of what I think are the advantages for residential colleges, it comes back to faculty and the relationships that students have with faculty. And so if you talk to employers, and especially CEOs, as I did during the reporting for this book, they'll talk a lot about students who had deep, engaged, rigorous experiences. And many times when you trace those back, they're traced back to individual faculty members. When I talk to students about how they pick their major, not at all colleges, but especially at elite colleges, by the way, they'll talk about how they pick their major based on professors that were good teachers and were good mentors, and less about, obviously they had an interest in that subject. But majors are fungible in many cases. Students change majors a lot. And so it's really about the faculty at the center. And so what's interesting to me is that we've moved more toward adjuncts, more toward part-time professors, when all this evidence is pointing to the need for more deeply engaged students. And especially, that's to me the differentiating factor between face-to-face education and online education, are the deep roots and the deep mentorships that you could provide. I think I'll try to move quickly through questions. I know that we need to try to keep on schedule, so I'll keep my answers short.
So I like the slide about sort of connecting the writer to the reader and the learner to the teacher. And given our conversation about measures and the essence or the the quality added of a college experience. I'd love to hear you think a little bit out loud about some of those measures that aim to get at more substantive measures than just graduation rates and all that kind of thing. What are you thinking about that? I mean, how?
Well, I think two of them that already exist are student engagement and the collegiate learning assessment. Both of which I know there's some controversy around them, but it's interesting to me that we have some tools already available that are not really publicly discussed. Try to be a student or a prospective student and ask about these things. You can't find them. Nobody talks about if they're participating, and now we have well over 1,000 schools doing the CLA, many more at some point doing the National Survey of Student Engagement. And if you look across the board and you look at what colleges are advertising, you can't find what they're doing on that. They don't talk about it. They don't like to talk about it, right? That to me, we have these tools that show engagement and that show student learning. Albeit, I mean, I know there are problems with it, but institutions are not talking enough about them. And I think that they should talk more about them. And I wish that we had more details across the board as well.
This isn't a question, it's just an observation regarding the disappearing state. The decline in funding for higher education, public higher education, is a matter of public policy effected at the legislative level in the states. We elect the legislators, and I think that to view our roles as passive agents in this is a big mistake. This is an area in the whole dynamic of the future of public higher education that we can have some influence on.
Well, thank you. Good? Sorry, we ran out of time. Thank you so much for your time today.